is that, some very good points. I'll pick up on that last point. Essentially, Howard seemed to be saying at the end there, far too much concentration post-crisis on regulatory repair, which has become complexity, and not enough, perhaps the next bit is not enough on growth, which is why the CMU now is suddenly, suddenly we have the CMU, as Howard said, oh my God, we've got to get growth going, we've got to get SMEs financed properly. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, but I think the two are connected, actually, and I think we need to back up a little bit because, I'm known in my role as the Vice President of the Economic Committee that I was the rapporteur for some very key pieces of legislation. But I think that you have to understand from the perspective of the crisis, everybody thought safety first. We need to put things back on track. We need to restore confidence and trust. And if you don't restore confidence and trust, you will not get growth. So we had to do that job, the job of cleaning up. And again, I would agree with Jacques that in a recent conversation I had with a Republican senator, he said to me, I hate Dodd-Frank. I hate it because it drove some of our good institutions to the wall. But then you have to ask the question, why did that happen? And maybe it wasn't that we shouldn't have had the legislation. What we should have done was had a very careful eye in terms of impact assessments, prior impact assessments, and looked very clearly at who should be covered by these rules. Where would we have exemptions? I mean, when we did the first CRD3 rules that I was working on, I actually, on behalf of my cooperative mutual banks, made a request to relieve some of those capital requirements because they didn't fall into that category of risk. So, of course, a lot of these small banks don't have the ability to lobby. They don't understand what's going on. I guess that's our job, both as legislators and regulators, to do that, to help them understand the system. But, I think we were dealing with an overly complex financial world in terms of products that led to a crisis. And you could say it was a knee-jerk response, was to come back and say, okay, where do we go now? We actually fix the system, we repair it. But now, of course, I think what we need to do is, for me, there are a number of very clear priorities. And I think those are, as we move into the implementation phase, are we actually divergent and at odds when we look at other jurisdictions? And we are, that's for sure. I mean, we've had, in my last 5 years on the committee, I spent a lot of time in the US, talking to the CFTC, the SEC, trying to work out how we could actually get our ducks in a row, manage to implement rules in an equivalent or substituted compliance way. That's very difficult in some circumstances. It's very difficult because we have to accept that we have very different financial markets. They're not homogeneous. We have different rule-making procedures. So if I went to see my counterpart in the Congress or the Senate, and I'd say to him, I don't think the SEC is dealing with this in the right way. And he said, yeah, but that's done now, our job's done. Whereas from our perspective, we can talk to the regulators because it comes back to us, and we can negotiate that perhaps in the interests of growth, we need to tweak some of those rules a little bit. That's not a possibility in the US, and the SEC and the CFTC are very hamstrung. I also went to Singapore and Hong Kong on a delegation. I mean, and I was amazed there in terms of capital requirements. They said, well, we're going to go beyond what's required that's being laid down by Basel because we think that's just safe. So there are very different approaches to issues, which means I think that now as we enter this phase of how do we shift towards the growth agenda, I think the real way we have to do that is to open up these cross-border compliance regimes in a way that the Commission now, I mean, Jonathan Hill has gone to Washington today. I hope he's going to get an agreement on some of the outstanding areas. But what happens quite frequently, and I think this is a point that has been made, I think, by Jacques as well, is that we get back into this scenario of consumer protection. We're protecting our investors, our consumers. That, in fact, quite often is national protectionism. And that's really what we have to crack. And it's a difficult area to crack. If I look at my own jurisdiction, look at all the mis-selling scandals we had. What we have then done in the FCA is to say we're going to go much further than anyone else in terms of banning commissions, banning various ways that investment management, IMAs can work, investment manager associations can work. What's now going to happen, though, in MiFID is they're going to pull back from that. They're going to pull back and say, actually, we're not going to ban that system. We're going to say you can do it, but you should demonstrate that there are enhanced quality criteria. Where does that then leave the UK legislator? Are they going to then implement MiFID rules and say, okay, we will give up our more stringent rules in the UK because actually maybe we don't need them and maybe we should just go for quality criteria. But the view I get is that they will not change things because their view is to protect their investors. They will then have to actually stick with that very tough rule. However, that will put the UK industry at a competitive disadvantage because the rules in other EU countries will be weaker, and indeed in other global jurisdictions they may be weaker. So this is, I think, an anomaly. I think it's a challenge we're going to continue to face. But maybe the argument is that when, I always say to people, I didn't invent the rules in the EU. When I used to have the backlash and saying that we were going too far, I didn't invent the rules. I don't think the Commission even invented the rules. The G20 set down what needed to be done to restore confidence in the financial system. So maybe, at the risk of criticising the FSB and the G20, perhaps they should have sat down with a plan and a graph saying this is how we think you should, in growth or in the spirit of implement these rules in a way that we don't have these kind of obstacles, we don't have the kind of, in a sense, the stopping capital from moving across borders because you have an entirely different rules inspired by the same objective of restoring confidence, but actually you end up with something very different. So I think that job should have been done. What we should say now is maybe the job still needs to be done. And I understand that under the stewardship of Mark Carney, that they are now looking at implementation reviews, monitoring peer reviews to try and check whether we've actually have a system that's workable globally, that we have a system that's workable, that will not impede or be an obstacle to growth in the long term.
I mean, Carol, if I can turn to you, what you've alluded to with the UK example is this idea that actually what we mean maybe by financial regulatory complexity is regulatory nationalism also, which is a problem. And that is, Carol, so if I can turn to you and pick that up, we are entering an era where we have balkanization globally of regulatory initiatives, which is exactly the opposite, surely, of what should be happening for growth. Fine, you can have your own. I mean, look, if I give the example of Singapore, where I'm based, Singapore is taking a very particular view of some of the OTC trading mandates, which is very in direct contradiction to what's going on in the West, and they're doing it for national market reasons. That's just one of many examples. Is that not one of the big problems with regulatory complexity? Is actually regulatory nationalism now? We're now in an era where regulators are looking inside their own borders, not out.
But let me start first probably with your experience, what you said in the beginning about Asia. We had this joint conference in Asia about 8 months ago. What surprised me when I was there, and we and SEPS are now increasingly focusing on Asia, not only on the United States, is that cooperation between jurisdictions in Asia is developing even without strong institutions. And you were in this conference where they announced this cooperation agreements on asset management, product recognition between different jurisdictions in Asia, there is one between Hong Kong and China, and mainland China. There is another one for products like we know it usage in Europe between, is it Indonesia, Australia, Singapore, and a fourth one. And that without institutions. So we have a very complex environment in Asia, but they cooperate with each other in a way which surprises Europeans. We, Europeans, on the other hand, need to have a very complex system to make us cooperate. And that's why we have, in fact, such complexity in Europe. We looked at it in the context of banking union. Why is the CRD4 so complex? It's basically we need to accommodate an extreme diversity of banking markets. And why? The SSM regulation in itself is not very complex, but the CRD4 is extremely complex because all the member states are sitting there in the council. You have to think about my savings banks and about my mortgage banks. And that's why, in the end, let's say we have a monster of a piece of regulation. And also, let's say if you looked at, we had a book on the banking union which we published. If you look at the number of banks in Europe which are active on a cross-border basis, it's a small minority. 900 or 1,000 there are 1,100 banking groups according to a calculation. 800 or 900 of these banking groups are only locally active. There are only about 20 or 30 groups which are really active in more than 5 member states in the European Union. So basically we're making rules for a few, and we have at the same time to accommodate all these diversity of different actors in different local markets which are used to different environments and different weighting rules, for example, for assets, because we have a different rule for mortgage weightings in Denmark or in Germany or in the UK.
It sounds to me very much like you're leading up to announcing that you're moving SEPs to Singapore. You've had enough.
It may be easier working over there, but that's what is surprising and also interesting to be there. I mean, the positiveness by which they cooperate in Asia with each other without institutions, or almost without institutions.
Well, I think
International institutions, I mean.
I think a lot of the cooperation in Asia is about heading off things that are coming their way from the West. It's driven by looking at what's going on in Europe. And when I was speaking to a lawyer at Clifford Chance, I don't mind naming the firm, in Singapore before I came out here, and the way his clients talk to him about the questions they have about equivalence coming out of Europe, they talk about, there is a fortress Europe developing, and we don't like that. Chinese banks eventually, providing research into Europe. How on earth is that going to work? Lots of unease among growing financial players in Asia about this, the way regulations are developing in Europe, the complexity and this fortress Europe mentality. And one of the things that came out was, a lot of what's going on in this town, I think, sometimes, is very much facing the US, Washington. The whole regulatory dance that goes on between Europe and the US has dominated the implementation of MiFID, EMIR, all this stuff. And the Asian jurisdictions see a lot of that's coming out of that and find that they're getting caught in the crossfire, because a lot of it's, quote unquote, aimed at the US because it's non-EU. But actually Asia gets caught in the crossfire.
We have concluded already 4 equivalence agreements
Yes,
with
exactly.
Asia, but not yet with the United States. Huh?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that is, the US is painfully aware of that, and they have taken note of that. Patrick Pearson was out in Singapore only last year, and he announced a couple of those, actually. I was there at the time. But there are other issues where, there are problems that clients of these firms are talking